Welcome everybody to our Best Interest Duty Get Bid Ready training course. Thanks very much for joining us today. We are a couple of months out from the implementation of the Best Interest Duty, and today you've joined us to be a part of what is our digital education course. And it is a course, and it's not like a normal webinar. Unfortunately, COVID has meant we've had to bring this to you in a different way to what we would normally hold such things. But remember, this is an educational course and questions will be asked afterwards. Yes, there is a second part to this that you also must complete. My name's Peter White, and welcome to the course. And I'm sure you'll enjoy the delivery of the Best Interest Duty, the Best Interest Duty key areas that we're going to impact your business over the coming hour to hour and a half. A couple of housekeeping things that we need to deal with right at the very beginning, and that is that the total course is worth 3 CPD hours to you. It is not able to be fragmented. It is 3 hours. You must do the whole course, otherwise you don't get the CPDs, okay? So this is part one of the course now, and you'll receive information in regards to the rest of the course after you've completed this piece. And of course, I want to say thanks to those that have worked with us to be able to bring this content to you, to FBAA, who's the underlying RTO, who is internationally renowned for their capabilities and work all around the globe in providing quality educational courses. David Carson from Compliance One, who has provided the expertise to be able to bring this course to you, and National Crime Check, who is a part of this journey when we talk about digital capabilities for verification. We'll talk more about that later. So thanks very much to everybody who supported us. This is being recorded and will be available on YouTube once we finish the entire course. And you can watch this and a whole host of other webinars through the FBAA's YouTube channel or via the FBAA website, where you can see at the top there, under the section called Upcoming Webinars. There's also the ability to look at what has happened in the past. So you can watch all this again in the future, should you wish other people to undergo the course, but remembering to access this course, you need to go through the registration process. All right, the other piece I need to bring to your attention, of course, is the agenda for today. So shortly, we will start to hear from David Carson, who will talk us through the Best Interest Duty and how that applies and impacts into your business, and how the law actually is structured for you to actually make sure you meet your compliance. This does not take the place of anything your aggregator is doing. This is, if you like, that sits over and above of what the aggregators are likely to talk to you about. This is so that you have a clear understanding of how the law impacts your business. And as I mentioned, after David has spoken to us, we will have Martin come and speak to us, and Martin will talk to us in regards to digital verifications of identity. And we'll look forward to that conversation, because that is going to be part and parcel of being able to meet your regulatory obligations. And of course, after that, we will have a Q&A, and that'll have everybody involved who's presenting today on that panel to answer your questions. You'll find there's a question box in the webinar control panel. Pop questions in there, and we'll answer them for you once we get to the Q&A session. And I mentioned before that this is the first part of the course that's being undertaken here by yourselves. The second part is that once you finish this, you'll be given a link that will go through to FBAA, as you can see on the slide there, to complete the knowledge testing component of it. Once you've successfully passed the knowledge test, you'll be given a certificate, and you'll also be given the compliance kit as well that will be available for you, and only available for you at that point in time. That kit contains a Best Interest Duty obligation flowchart, so you can see, depending on the transaction, the conversations you're having with your client, as to how the Best Interest Duty will impact and what decisions you will need to have in relation to that potential impact in regards to looking after that client. And there is also a obligation record keeping tool and a compliance self-assessment tool. These have been uniquely designed, and they are being built by an expert, and our expert's going to talk next, to help you manage your business. And with specifically in mind that if ASIC comes knocking on the door, this is at least, not everything, but at least the things you will need to have to be able to shore up that you have acted in the best interest of your client. Anyhow, that's probably enough for me. We're a couple of months out from bid, and it's important we get our facts right and that we understand what we're doing, that we have our regulatory compliance met, and ensure that we are unquestionably acting in the best interest of the client. So I think from now, it's more than enough for me, and I'd like to introduce and hand over to David Carson from Compliance One. Thanks very much, and over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Peter. Hello and welcome everybody to this FBAA session on the mortgage broker's best interest duty. I'm just going to make sure that I'm sharing all of the relevant cameras and things that I need to, and here I am. So welcome, hello everyone. So today's session, we're going to take you through the key elements of the mortgage broker's best interest duty and what it means for you. The session will cover who the duty applies to, what the duty is, the obligations that are created by this new best interest duty, and some tips on how to demonstrate compliance with the duty, which of course is very important for satisfying your obligations when you're demonstrating that to a regulator. Get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. So this is a training session which is intended to provide members with a high level understanding of the consumer credit regulatory regime and the guidance around the key concepts of the best interest duty. The examples used in the module are created to draw out specific issues and highlight different perspectives. And of course, they shouldn't be relied on as complete solutions to specific issues or obligations that arise under the legislation. And so there'll be several times during the presentation today that we will say that we're encouraging you to seek independent advice if you have specific questions about how the duties apply to you and what you need to do to meet your obligations. Another little bit of housekeeping is, let's just get it out of the way early, say it like you mean it. So it is a best interests duty with the S on the end, not a best interest duty. I like to reinforce that because I think using the right terminology better demonstrates that you actually understand it. It's also the way that it's used in the legislation and the guidance. So it's a best interests duty. Throughout the training today, we're going to refer to that as the bid. In most cases, it's nice and simple. Also importantly today, when we're talking about the bid applying to brokers or mortgage brokers, we're also including mortgage intermediaries in that explanation. And I will touch on the definition of a mortgage intermediary in just a couple of slides. So how do we summarise the best interest duty or the bid? Well, the actual bid itself is very simple. It's simply an obligation to act in the consumer's best interests. The legislation is equally simple, and it simply says that a mortgage broker has to act in a client's best interests. Now, in contrast to the simplicity of the legislation, ASIC's version 1 of its regulatory guidance is already reasonably complex. So we have a situation of the law being quite simple in the way it's expressed, but when it comes to interpreting how those legal obligations apply, the guidance around how they apply starts to already become quite complex. So I like to develop a simple way of summarising the duty so that it makes it easier to refer to in the future. And here's one way that it can be summarised. So the objective of the best interest duty legislation is to ensure that when mortgage brokers assist consumers to apply for a mortgage, the consumers get good advice or good information and they end up in the right product. So to put it simply, the best interest duty says that your job as a mortgage broker is to put your customers into the product that best suits them. Now, I've also brought in some big guns to give you an alternative impression of alternative understanding. So just bear with me a moment.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
So I hope that helps you. So there we have it. The mortgage broker's best interest duty, as summed up by what many of you would recognise is a great little excerpt from the movie The Castle, it's the vibe. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of background now. And I will come back to a better explanation of the best interest duty in time. So the best interest duty requires mortgage brokers to act in the best interest of consumers when providing credit assistance in relation to credit contracts. That's the way it's expressed in the legislation. So note that this is actually different to the way in which Commissioner Hayne said it should be expressed when he made a recommendation out of the Royal Commission to introduce the best interest duty. So Commissioner Hayne said, when acting in connection with home lending, mortgage brokers must act in the best interests of the intending borrower. So that, I beg your pardon, I'll skip the slide, but anyway, I'll come back to it. So I have actually skipped a slide, I beg your pardon. I'm speaking off the wrong note. So let's start this one again. So the best interest for mortgage brokers, we'll talk about why it was introduced. It follows a very similar path to that of the financial advice regime. So in 2002, the Corporations Act introduced a licensing regime for financial advisors. And the original test of the financial advice that was given by financial advisors to customers was that the advice had to be appropriate. And over the years, that test was tested many times and proven to not be strong enough to prevent below average, but not inappropriate advice. So in essence, the test was seen as providing mediocre advice. So about 10 years after the introduction of the appropriate test for financial advice, a best interest duty was introduced by changes to the financial advice laws in 2012. So when we look at that and how that plays out under the NCCP, the credit legislation was brought in 2009, and responsible lending had at the core of its test a not unsuitable test. So that was the credit assistance when provided to consumers had to be not unsuitable. It's about 10 years since that test was introduced, and the Royal Commission found that that test was not giving adequate protection to customers, and therefore the best interest duty has been introduced for brokers. I beg your pardon, this was the slide I was talking about before. The mortgage broker's best interest duty requires you to act in the best interest of consumers when providing credit assistance in relation to credit contracts. As I also said before, the Royal Commission said that it should be connected to providing credit assistance in relation to home loans, but when that recommendation was turned into the new laws, the duty has been extended beyond that to apply to all credit assistance given by somebody who is defined as a mortgage broker. Thus, the best interest duty is a person test, not an activity test. So what that means is the duty applies to everybody who is defined as a mortgage broker, and not solely to a person when they're engaging in an activity of providing credit assistance to someone in relation to a home loan or providing a mortgage broking service. The parties that are exempt from the best interest duty include mortgage managers and those advising in products from a single credit provider, namely, or generally speaking, people employed by a credit provider to recommend their own products. And as we know, the best interest duty was originally slated to commence in the middle of the year, on 1 July 2020, and was extended, the commencement was extended to 1st of January 2021. So the next couple of slides are a little bit dry, but we've got to get through them. Who is a mortgage broker or an intermediary by definition? So prior to the introduction of this best interest duty, there was no definition of mortgage broker in the law. And so a mortgage broker has been now defined in the credit legislation. And in broad terms, you are a mortgage broker if you are in the business of helping consumers apply for a mortgage. And you're a mortgage intermediary if you don't provide credit assistance, but you're otherwise involved in introducing consumers to the mortgage. This is the only time, I promise, in all of the presentation that we'll actually put legislation up on screen, but this is just to help you understand how these definitions have been created. So Section 15B in the National Consumer Credit Protection Act introduces this new definition of a mortgage broker. And a licensee is a mortgage broker if they carry on a business of providing credit assistance in relation to contracts secured by mortgages over residential property, and they don't perform the obligations or exercise the rights of the credit provider in relation to a majority of those credit contracts. What that means is that they're not a mortgage manager. And in carrying on the business, the licensee provides credit assistance in relation to contracts offered by more than one credit provider. And so they're not employed or engaged by a credit provider to promote their own products. So a credit representative is a mortgage broker if they're appointed by a licensee who is defined as a mortgage broker on those same terms. The definition for mortgage intermediary follows straight after that, and it's almost identical, except that it distinguishes providing credit assistance, and that is assisting customers to apply for a loan or complete an application for a loan. It replaces providing credit assistance with that of acting as an intermediary. And so that is somewhat involved in the customer going from finding a product and entering into it, but they stop short of providing credit assistance. Now, I think everybody attending today would have a clear understanding of their own businesses and whether they're a mortgage intermediary or a mortgage broker, or they're providing credit assistance. But if you are unsure, then you should seek further advice on that, because it's quite important. So the other part of it, we know who it applies to. It applies to mortgage brokers and it applies to mortgage intermediaries. The other part is, what does carrying on a business mean? Well, the explanatory memorandum to the legislation as it came in isn't very helpful. What it says is, carrying on a business is intended to take its general legal meaning. The credit legislation doesn't define what carrying on a business is, because that concept has been around for a long time, and so there is a broader meaning. The only way that we really can find out what it means is to look into the case law, and we don't have time for that. So we're going to pop out a general rule and say this. As a general rule, helping consumers apply for a loan more than 3 or 4 times a year is likely to be enough to have your activities categorised as carrying on a business of engaging in that activity. So the sort of things that are considered are whether you're engaging in a particular course of behaviour with any systemic, repetitious or continuous type behaviour. Now, for most cases, again, it's going to be pretty clear. You're either in or you're outside the tent. But again, if you're unsure, you should seek legal advice. Okay, so that's who it applies to. Let's talk about the best interest duty itself. Best interest is actually quite difficult to define, and it's defined as an outcome rather than a particular thing. And to demonstrate how difficult it is to define, the concept of best interest isn't defined in the legislation, nor is it defined in the ASIC guidance. So we don't actually have a definition of what best interests means. However, don't despair. The purpose of this training session is for us to talk about what it means to act in the best interest of a client and how to demonstrate that you've done that. As I said before, best interest duty, it's the vibe, and that actually isn't that far from the truth. So as you know, ASIC produces regulatory guidance. It is there to help you understand how ASIC interprets the law and how they're going to police it. And we've seen obviously a lot of discussion lately around responsible lending, where ASIC's previous guidance about responsible lending was challenged in court, and the courts have had a look at that and said there's a bit of a gap between ASIC's interpretation of how the laws apply and what the intention of that law is. We're heading down a not dissimilar path at the moment with RG 273, which is the regulatory guidance around the best interest duty for mortgage brokers. The law is very simple and the ASIC regulatory guidance is a lot more complex. But what it says at its core in the guidance, it says the law requires that brokers determine the best interest of the consumer, present recommendations to the consumer in line with those interests. The explanatory memorandum, which explains the purpose of the legislation, says the objective of the bid is to improve consumer outcomes. And what I take away from that, to put it a different way again, is that the intention of the new laws is to ensure consumers end up in products that make the best of their situation, even where the consumer is not aware of what products they might be at the time. So why is the best interest so difficult to define? Well, partly it's so difficult to define because there are so many different interpretations. Customers don't always know what's in their own best interests. They're sometimes misinformed, influenced by others who are equally ill-informed. I'm sure many of you have seen the ad on television where the hairdresser's telling a customer to take out a mortgage for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. Customers get their information from biased sources, and they're also selective listeners at times. And so they don't always know what's in their own best interests. Consumer objectives are sometimes mutually exclusive. I want lots of features, but a really low rate. How many of you have heard that before? How well do the lawmakers really understand the industry? Those in government that are making the legislation and that are writing the guidance around this legislation, very few of those would have sat in front of a client, taken an application or assisted somebody to apply for a mortgage. And so they're writing guidance trying to steer industry, perhaps not well as informed as they could be. And finally, for this slide at least, best is a superlative. There can be many good outcomes, but there's usually only one best outcome for every scenario. Superlatives like biggest and fastest, they're all ultimately capable of being tested, and there can only be one right answer. The best competitor gets the gold medal, the best score wins the tournament. So the term best interests is itself a little bit misleading because it can be construed by people to suggest it means you have to get the single best available outcome for the customer. And this is why the best interest duty is expressed as a duty and not a best product or a best outcome duty. It is a best interests duty. So don't be too distracted by the terminology. The point of it is to just make clear that if you're going to make a recommendation, make sure that it's clearly aligned with the consumer's objectives. And if it's not out of step with the market and you can demonstrate that you're acting in the consumer's best interests, even if there may be other products in the marketplace that are comparable or at various times even slightly better than the product you recommend. So it's not a best product duty, it's just an obligation to act to demonstrate that you've acted in the best interests of the consumer. Now, as I said, the legislation is quite simple, it's quite succinct. It just says you have a duty to act in the consumer's best interests. When we turn to the ASIC regulatory guidance, we get a lot more detail about what ASIC interprets those obligations to mean. So what ASIC says is when acting in the consumer's best interests, brokers will be able to demonstrate that they've done the following things. Now remember, this is ASIC guidance, this isn't the law, but of course, it takes a lot of courage to do something different to what a regulator is telling you to do, and we don't want to all end up in federal court having to argue our case. So the ASIC guidance is there to help you set the expectations of the regulator on how to behave and what you need to do. So the summary of the ASIC guidance, which is quite long, is that you will be able to demonstrate you've done the following things. You've explored the consumer's requirements and objectives. That's also an obligation under responsible lending. You'll be able to show that you've explained the features of products and educated consumers to help them make informed decisions. You'll have considered whether the customers were eligible for grants or schemes. You will have considered multiple products, of course, where that's possible and practical. There are situations where customers may not be eligible for a wide range of products. You will have considered cost as an important aspect of product selection. That doesn't mean cost is the only thing to take into account, but you should demonstrate that cost has been considered as an important factor. You've correctly weighted product features and other factors. So that is in the alignment of customers being matched up with the right product. If they're going into a more expensive product because of a particular feature, there'll be some assessment have been made about the cost of the value of that feature and whether the customer's actually going to derive a benefit for it. You will have prioritised the consumer's needs and avoided conflicts of interest. You'll ensure that products that are bundled with the mortgage are also in the consumer's best interests. Your file will show reasons why certain possible options were not recommended, particularly where they're the lower cost products or where they appear to be a more logical recommendation. And I will come back to that point as well. And you'll be able to demonstrate what product you ultimately recommended and why you recommended that particular product. So there's quite a lot of bullet points there, but that's, in essence, that's the summary of Regulatory Guide 273 from ASIC. ASIC says when it comes and looks at a file, it's expecting to see those things. And if the file tells them this story, then you can be pretty comfortable that you're complying with the best interest duty. So what are the core elements of the best interest duty? Well, comprehensive record keeping is certainly here to stay. That's one thing that is absolutely clear from the change. Responsible lending, of course, had a limited range of records that you needed to create. You needed to perform an assessment of unsuitability. You needed a quote, a credit guide, and a credit proposal disclosure document, but that was it. So there was no actual obligation to keep explaining how you got to your recommendation and do a lot of other things. Of course, many people do record those things down in their files. They're not always kept together. And so what ASIC has kind of done with this best interest duty is that they've really pushed down that pathway of saying, improve your record keeping because we want you to show to us what you did and how you got to the end result. So a key point of this is if it's written down, it never happened. Again, really reinforcing the need for comprehensive record keeping. Throughout this at the end of this training, you'll receive a record keeping checklist that will give you a summary of the records that ASIC has said they would like to see on a file. If you can see that you're creating the records that appear in the record keeping checklist, you can be pretty comfortable that if ASIC comes looking at your files, they will see everything they're expecting to see. And for your own well-being, brokers should demonstrate that they regularly review the marketplace to ensure the products that they recommend are competitive, and furthermore that you took steps to educate the consumer. So what the regulator's looking for, what the legislation is looking for is for customers to be more informed and be more engaged with the decisions they're making. And ASIC has said that they think that you should be demonstrating that you considered whether consumers might be eligible for particular government schemes. And also, if the customer didn't give you the right sort of instructions, that you considered whether there were better alternatives to what the customer wanted. So you're not always obligated to give the customer or the consumer what they've asked for. You're actually obligated to recommend to the consumer what's in their best interests. Other core elements of the best interest duty. You've got to accommodate each consumer's individual merits and recommend competitive products that align with their circumstances. The important thing is that you don't try and fit the consumer into a narrow range of products that you simply prefer to deal with. Now, under the responsible lending obligations, it would have been much harder for a regulator to take issue with that, because provided the product that you recommended was not unsuitable, you would have been meeting the test of the obligation that fit within responsible lending. Best interest is different. It's a more stringent test, and it is possible that you aren't meeting the consumer's best interests if you put every consumer you deal with into a particular product. Now, there are exceptions, as there are with everything. It could be that you specialise in a particular product and you locate a particular client of a particular type such that they do align with a very narrow range of products, but you need to be aware of the risk of what that would look like to an external person. So there is a significantly higher risk of not complying with the best interest duty or being able to demonstrate your compliance with the best interest duty if all of your services are predefined by which lenders you prefer to deal with. Business structures can embed the risk of breaching the best interest duty regardless of the assistance you provide. Again, by unduly restricting product selection or otherwise influencing the decisions and the recommendations that are made. Now, it's my speculation, there's nothing proven on this final point, but I think the early cases of ASIC looking to prosecute breaches of the best interest duty are likely to include them taking on business models that artificially constrict choice. So if they can show that because of a particular type of business model, brokers weren't adequately considering a broad market, weren't recommending products that necessarily could compete on merits with other products in the marketplace, then it would be a relatively strong case for ASIC to take on as an early one, as a test case. So we'll watch the marketplace for that. Now, conflicts of interest has been strengthened through this best interest duty. There is already a requirement under the NCCP Act to ensure that conflicts of interest do not disadvantage consumers. So up until now, the way in which we've really interpreted that is to say, well, First of all, you need to know what conflicts of interest are potentially embedded within your business, and then you need to test or work out whether they disadvantage the consumer. And if they do disadvantage the consumer, you're not allowed to actually provide a service to the consumer. You have to actually avoid disadvantaging the consumer. And that was a big difference under the financial advice regime, because under the financial advice regime, it was possible to disclose your conflicts, but then still give advice to customers that was influenced by conflicts of interest. Under the NCCP Act, you actually had to avoid disadvantaging consumers. And so you couldn't merely disclose the conflict and then proceed to give credit assistance that harmed them. So the best interest duty legislation introduces a conflict priority rule, and it introduces a ban on conflicted remuneration. So it has introduced a lot more strength around conflicts. Conflicted remuneration means any benefit, whether monetary or non-monetary, that is given to a licensee or a rep who provides credit assistance to consumers, and because of the nature or benefit of the circumstances in which it is given, could reasonably be expected to influence the credit assistance provided to consumers. So basically what that says is all remuneration is conflicted unless it's exempted. And the ban on conflicted remuneration is both on licensees paying it to representatives and on representatives receiving it. The conflict priority rule says you have to prioritise the interests of the consumer if you know or ought reasonably to know when you provide credit assistance that there is a conflict between the interests of the consumer and interested parties. You've got to resolve all conflicts in the consumer's favour. And if you can't do that, don't provide credit assistance. So obviously, if you're going to manage this obligation, the first thing you need to do is to identify what potential conflicts of interest exist within your business. And then the sensible thing to do is to record them in a register so that you can demonstrate externally if somebody comes asking that you routinely look at your business, work out if there's any potential conflicts that are influencing your assistance, and that you've got a mechanism in place to deal with those conflicts. And I think it's important to also say that not all interests are in conflict with the consumer. Some can be mutually beneficial. After all, you get paid for giving credit assistance to a consumer, so that's remuneration to you. Consumer wants to find a mortgage. So you're providing a service to the consumer, you're getting paid. You have a mutual interest in the outcome. So what happens with conflicted remuneration is that it's the regulations that actually say what isn't. So as I said, pretty much all remuneration is conflicted unless it's defined in the regulations as being exempt. So the main ones that are not, or the ones that are not conflicted, the first one is any benefit given by a consumer to a licensee for a credit service. So that is a direct fee. So direct fee, customer to rep or customer to licensee is not conflicted remuneration. And the other benefits relating to credit services that are excluded, not volume or campaign-based payments, commission that is paid on the drawn down amount of a credit contract, commission paid under a clawback arrangement that doesn't exceed 2 years, amounts that are paid that are non-monetary, but are under $300 in value, and not too frequently. You couldn't have a regular payment of something just under $300 that amounts to a lot over the course of a short period of time, and payments that are made to support education, training, and IT support. So there's a few things in there in the conflicted remuneration. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what best interest is, and let me just tell you a couple of things about what best interest duty is not. It's not a cheapest product obligation. It's not a best product obligation. It's an obligation to consider, it's not an obligation to consider every product in the marketplace. It's not an obligation to give the consumer what they're asking for. It's not an obligation to provide credit assistance to every person. You may find that you don't want to provide credit assistance to somebody based on their circumstances or based on the nature of the relationship you have. You're not obligated to deal with every consumer who you meet. And furthermore, whilst ASIC has suggested it would be good if you did refer somebody that you don't want to deal with to another broker, the best interest duty doesn't actually impose an obligation on you to do that. So you're not obligated to refer off customers to somebody else if you don't want to deal with them. So ASIC has suggested it would be good to see these things. They'd love to see the cheapest product. They'd love to see brokers consider every single product in the marketplace and exclude them all. All of those things. So ASIC said it'd be nice to see them, and they may look for them in your files, but if they're not there, the law hasn't yet said those things must be done. So just something to keep in mind. Let's look at a few of the core obligations that arise under the best interest duty. So there's been reference to government schemes. There's nothing in the legislation that says you've got to consider government schemes, but of course the ASIC guidance has introduced this notion. And what they've seen in the past, I think, is situations where particular consumers may have been eligible for some assistance and could have availed themselves of certain government schemes that are in place to limit or reduce the amount of money that they borrow, and that in all cases that hasn't been explored with the consumers. So ASIC's introduced guidance to say that it would expect that mortgage brokers, as a part of meeting the consumer's best interests, would be aware of the main government schemes and grants that are available to first home buyers, pensioners and social housing tenants, and would consider if your customer is potentially eligible, and if they are potentially eligible, you should tell them to apply for those schemes, and you may even assist them to apply. Bundling has also been addressed in the regulatory guidance for BID. So many products are bundled with mortgage products, such as credit cards. Now, the general position at the moment, as we interpret it, is that the BID applies to the overall package. That is, when you look at holistically the service that's been provided to the consumer and the mortgage and the bundled product, that overall package meets the best interests of the consumer. Now, Treasury has clarified in its explanatory memorandum to the law that the BID applies to the bundle. Again, the package. So that is, when you holistically look at the mortgage and the other package products, does that overall outcome meet the best interests of the consumer? ASIC guidance goes in a slightly different direction. ASIC guidance says, recommendations to consumers should identify and consider for each product within the package how those products will meet the consumer's needs, objectives, priorities and preferences, and whether suggesting the consumer take out that product as part of the package would be in the consumer's best interests. So the guidance is a lot more granular than what we understand the legal position to be that's expressed by Treasury and in the legislation. So there is actually no way to reconcile that at this point in time, but it is something we need to keep an eye on, and it is something the FBAA has been doing some work around with respect to communicating that difference to Treasury and also to ASIC to find some clarification. The outcome of that is really that manifestly inappropriate products shouldn't be bundled up and put onto a consumer. So you should be avoiding those sort of situations. But overall, if you're acting in the best interests of the consumer and you are putting forward a package that has ancillary products with it, then provided that package meets the customer's best interests, you would be reasonably safe. Sounds like a bit of fence straddling going on there, but it is actually sometimes really hard to find the line on those things. So the product list, this is also an area of intense interest. If you're interested in the paragraphs for the regulatory guidance, RG 273, 112 to 1115 gives you information about the product list. You need to be accredited with a reasonably representative panel of credit providers / have sufficient products to allow you to act in the consumer's best interests. You need to be aware of other products in the market. Now, there's no expectation to recommend specific products outside of your panel. ASIC has said in the guidance, it'd be great if you can identify a product that's not on your panel and you can either become accredited for a product, or you might say, look, there's a better product for you and I can't recommend it. You should go and see somebody else and get that product. Actually, no, don't say get that product, because that would be credit assistance. So say to that person, go and see another broker because I can't recommend the product for you. I think in practice though, that's a very unrealistic expectation. It would be extremely difficult to expect brokers to be acutely aware of much better products in the marketplace but not be able to recommend them. So I don't know how often that situation in reality would arise. But the $1 million question in relation to product list is, how many products do you need to have on your approved list or panel for lenders to meet, or your panel of lenders for you to be able to demonstrate that you meet your best interest duty? Sadly, that is my answer. How long is a piece of string? In reality, though, your product panel should be reasonably representative of the market you deal in. So that ties back to one of those earlier things we said about not unduly restricting your product list. The panel list should cover the range of scenarios, or you should know when to decline to provide credit assistance. So if you're aware of a certain type of scenario that you don't generally give credit assistance in relation to, somebody comes to you seeking assistance for that type of scenario, it's incumbent on you as a professional to say, yeah, that's not in my area. I recommend you go see someone else for that. You should still demonstrate awareness of other products in the marketplace, particularly if your panel is quite small. So that's pretty much the guidance we can give on that. So I'll give you a scenario, and this is a not uncommon scenario. Your business attracts a particular type of client that is ideally suited to a particular product through a particular provider. It's a good product and it serves these clients very well. However, on review, ASIC says your product concentration is too high and accuses you of ignoring the best interest duty and pushing the product onto every customer who walks through the door. So how, in a practical sense, do you defend an accusation of product pushing and breaching the best interest duty when you do have a high concentration of applications going to a particular lender? So sure, you can ask the federal court to make a decision for you, which is what Westpac did, but win or lose, you're going to spend a lot of money finding out. Now, the reason I put this scenario up is because there is no really easy answer to it. You may in fact be a business that is highly specialised and therefore you do have a particular niche which results in you putting your clients to a particular lender very, very frequently. I think in those situations, it's important to have good records. Create good records about why you're in that niche, why those people come to you, and why the outcome of you giving credit assistance is very frequently to put them to a particular provider. And I think it would also be important in that situation to demonstrate that you're aware of what other products are in the market, such that you could say, we know that customers are not going to qualify for many other products because of this particular type of client we deal with. But one licensee could legitimately put a very high proportion of clients to one particular provider and comply with bid. Another licensee could do exactly the same thing and not comply with bid. It really comes down to how legitimate it is that you're putting a certain percentage of your clients to a particular provider, whether it's your preference as the broker, which is unlikely to be a best interest duty move, or whether it's the circumstances of the consumers that you're dealing with. Quite often, the outcome of this is going to really depend on the records that you keep. Product switching. So the best interest duty will apply to product switching. Again, if we go back to the financial services regime, a lot of work was done in switching where where financial advisors could switch a client from one superannuation fund to another superannuation fund. When we had a situation of switching one super fund to another super fund and you tested that against appropriate advice, you'd say it's not inappropriate to put a client into superannuation. And so switching a client from one super fund to another wouldn't be seen as something that was inappropriate. But when the best interest duty came in, the test changed under financial advice to say, well, what's the benefit to the customer in switching? And sometimes if a customer switched from one fund to another and ended up paying higher fees in the second fund, it would actually not be in their best interest to switch. And so when best interest duty came in for financial advisors, product switching became a lot more challenging and a lot more loaded with risk. And I think that with the best interest duty, there will be more risk with product switching. All of a sudden, it's no longer the not inappropriate test. It's going to be, is it in the best interest of the customer to switch? And so generally speaking, the outcome of the product switch should be an overall cost saving, or if there's no cost saving or minimal savings, you should be able to demonstrate better alignment with the consumer's needs and objectives. Some consideration of the existing product the client's in is likely to be required so that you can demonstrate there was a genuine benefit or that you'd identified a benefit or a purpose for the switch. So here's the next bit. The test for best interest duty compliance is not which product the consumer chooses. And so at the end of the day, if you're assisting consumers to apply for a range of products, the test that ASIC would apply to see if you as brokers had met your obligations isn't going to be to look at the product the customers ended up with. They might look at the product to try and get a sense of whether customers look like they're going in the right place, but the real test is that you have to demonstrate that you're meeting the obligations that apply to you as a broker. And those obligations we talked about earlier, and several of them are here again, the best interest duty requires that you as a broker demonstrate that you knew your customers' objectives, that you knew the products you were recommending, you took steps to make sure the customer understood the products they were applying for, you considered if they might have been eligible for government schemes, and you made a recommendation that matched up the product with the customer's needs and objectives. That's what's going to satisfy the best interest duty obligations. If the customer says, or the consumer says to you, that's great, I like your recommendation, but I want to apply for a different product, then that's okay. You can still help them apply for that product without breaching your best interest duty obligations, provided you've also drawn the customer's attention to the product that you think best meets their obligations. Probably the only qualification I'd say to that is if a customer wants to apply for something that's really harmful to themselves, you would be taking a risk in assisting them to apply, because you may end up being held accountable for the customer's decision, even though it was their decision. So there's more risk if the products are really not good. So if you've made a reasonable effort to identify products in the market, you've made the customer aware of that product, you can still help them apply. And as I said, if you presented them with an option that shows that you gave them a good recommendation, what happens to that? What happens beyond that is not such a big deal. But you won't be able to defend an accusation of breaching of the bid if you help the customer hurt themselves. So let's take a quick look at responsible lending and how it mixes in with the best interest duty. We know that responsible lending is a little bit up in the air now with the government's announcement to shift regulation of responsible lending away from ASIC and over to APRA. It's important to understand that responsible lending isn't stopping. It is continuing to be an obligation. However, it will be administered by APRA and under a framework which is probably less prescriptive than that which has been established through ASIC's regulatory guidance, and particularly RG 209. RG 209 was the regulatory guidance that became a bit of a focus of the Westpac responsible lending case, and arguably really lit the fuse for responsible lending being taken away from ASIC and being put back in the hands of APRA to regulate. So the requirements of responsible lending are at the moment to understand the consumer's needs and objectives, to assess their financial capacity to service a proposed loan, and to ensure they end up in a product that meets their needs and objectives and is one that they can afford. So in other words, give the consumer a suitable product that they can afford. That is responsible lending. Best interest duty doesn't change your responsible lending obligations. It just adds some additional requirements on top of responsible lending. So as we've talked about, it requires you to think holistically about what's the best course of action for the consumer. It requires you to take a little bit more care to ensure the consumer understands the product, and it requires you to demonstrate that you've got a reasonable range of products that you can recommend from. So let's look at how that plays out in a scenario. So under responsible lending, consumer A needs a home loan and wants an offset account. They have a relatively low, stable income. Under that scenario, a broker could recommend a home loan with offset account with a preferred lender that has a higher interest rate than competitor products in the marketplace, whilst appearing to comply with the responsible lending obligations. After all, the customer wants an offset account with a home loan. The broker has recommended an offset account with a home loan. Therefore, the recommendation is unlikely to be unsuitable. So it meets the responsible lending test of being not unsuitable. If you look at how that might play out under a best interest duty scenario, the customer's the same, low, stable income, they want an offset account. Now, A licensee can still recommend a home loan with an offset account with a preferred lender and that has a higher interest rate, but there is a greater risk of breaching the best interest duty unless you can address some of the other issues that arise under best interest duty. So for example, has the broker considered or the licensee considered whether the offset account is the best thing for the consumer? Were there cheaper products that weren't recommended? Does the consumer understand what an offset product is? Or has somebody just said to them, mate, you should get an offset? Do they understand the implications of taking out a product that may be such as an offset that has a higher base rate than, say, a no frills product? Now, when you look at someone who's got low stable income, and if most of that income is already consumed through meeting their daily expenses, their capacity to actually accumulate additional savings and to benefit from an offset may be more difficult to demonstrate. So it's not impossible to meet this scenario under both responsible lending and bid. But what I would say is that under responsible lending, very low risk of any problems. Under best interest duty, there is potentially a little bit more obligation, a little bit more risk, I beg your pardon. So we're nearing the end. We've got a couple more slides and we'll talk more generally about licensee obligations. So we've talked a lot about who a mortgage broker is, who a mortgage intermediary is. We've talked about when the obligations apply. We've talked about what ASIC expects you to be able to demonstrate to show that you've met those obligations. So we'll talk now about just a few other issues that sit around the fringes or that fit in together with the other obligations that arise under this best interest duty. So there doesn't actually have to be a breach of a best interest duty for a licensee to breach its obligations. Licensees must take reasonable steps to make sure their credit representatives comply with the best interest duty. Now that's a core obligation under the NCCP Act, and it's also been reaffirmed under the Regulatory Guide 273. Licensees must provide systems, training, rules, and guidance to their representatives. They must ensure brokers are adequately trained and competent, monitored for compliance, and adequate records are kept. So if a licensee doesn't do those things, it becomes immaterial whether a representative has breached best interest duty or not. If licensees don't have proper structures in place to provide systems, training, recording adequate notes, be monitoring your representatives for compliance, then you may be deemed to be holistically or intrinsically breaching the best interest duty because your structures are not adequate to be able to demonstrate that you're enabling your representatives and employees to meet the best interest duty. Now, the original Royal Commission recommendation was that the best interest duty applied to mortgage brokers when acting in connection with a home loan. And as we talked about earlier, that has been broadened out in the legislation to say that once you are a mortgage broker, you must act in the best interests of the client, the consumer, when providing credit assistance. So what that means is that all credit assistance given by somebody who falls under the definition of a mortgage broker is subject to a best interest duty. So for a licensee who is defined as a mortgage broker, all other credit assistance provided by that licensee is subject to the best interest duty. Credit reps acting within the scope of the appointment by that licensee, if either of the rep or the licensee is a mortgage broker, all other credit assistance provided by them in that capacity is subject to the bid. So a representative of more than one licensee may be able to segregate their services if one licensee is a mortgage broker and the other licensee is not. But it's not possible to segregate your services once you fall under that definition of a mortgage broker, because the best interest duty applies to the mortgage broker, the person, not the activity. And so this raises a couple of structural considerations, and this is a very complex area, so members should seek advice. But it may be worth considering whether your current structure unnecessarily invites the application of the best interest duty to some of the services that you provide. For example, if you're in asset finance and you do relatively few mortgages in a year, if you do enough to be considered to be carrying on a business or in the business of being a mortgage broker, then you are then defined as a mortgage broker, and BID will apply to all the credit assistance you provide in relation to everything, including the other asset finance activities. So one option obviously would be to consider whether it may be possible to separate out those activities and have your asset finance activities carried out through a different entity. Another place where activities can become commingled is where you do consumer and commercial. It is murkier if you are providing consumer mortgage broking and you're defined as a mortgage broker, and then you're also doing commercial, even though it's been very clearly expressed by government that commercial is not intended to be caught by this. In practice, it becomes harder to separate them out. And we've certainly seen with AFCA, the External Dispute Resolution Body, that if you are a licensee who does consumer, you must be an AFCA member, as it's a condition of you holding your license to be an AFCA member. But once you're an AFCA member, if you've provided commercial activities, the customers of your commercial business can also take their claim to AFCA. Whereas if you were solely a commercial business, you wouldn't hold AFCA membership, and that person wouldn't be able to take the claim to AFCA in those circumstances. So if unregulated and regulated activities are carried out under one entity, your unlicensed activities may be dragged in. And just a final word on anti-avoidance. So you cannot enter into or carry out a scheme or arrangement where the sole or primary purpose of avoiding the application of the BID laws is the driver. And that's expressed in the BID legislation. The guidance also makes mention of this. So as with the structural considerations, this can be a complex area and you should seek your own advice. But you would say that it's not a, if you undertake an exercise of separating out your mortgage broker activities from your other activities, that wouldn't be a scheme or arrangement with the sole or primary purpose of avoiding the application of the BID laws. It would probably be seen more as a rational and commercial purpose for separating out your activities into different structures. But a scheme is likely to be scrutinised if it results in you providing something that looks like mortgage broking services to consumers in circumstances where you claim BID doesn't apply because of your structural considerations. So it can be quite complex, but I think it is important that we now look at the frameworks that we're all operating under and consider whether they're still appropriate going into this new era of best interest duty. And so thank you very much, everybody. That is the end of the presentation. There's a couple of resources at the end there. If you want to delve further, I'm sure many of you enjoy reading ASIC regulatory guidance, and if you particularly enjoy reading legislation, there's a doozy for you there as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, David. And I don't know about you, but I do not enjoy reading regulatory papers that much. Hence, that's why we have you as a part of our team. Folks, please thank David for his presentation. Important that you understand that David is ex-ASIC and wrote large parcels of the NCCP. And as far as I am concerned, and with the amount of people that I speak to around this country, David is, to me, the leading expert in this field. I know sometimes regulatory matters get a little bit dry, but this is something we need to be across. This is something that is extraordinarily important from a regulatory environment as we step into the beginning of 2021, and you must be across this. Obviously, of course, your aggregator will provide you with the wheres and wherefores and means for your compliance needs. But a part of the completion of this course, once you do complete it, and that'll be post the knowledge testing that will come to you separately after this with AAMC, yes, you get your certificate, but in that compliance pack will be documents there that have been purpose-built with the expressed knowledge of how ASIC thinks through things. It's not an ASIC-provided list, but it's how they think through things. It's what they're going to expect to see based on what we've seen in the regulatory guidance to date. And it's going to be a very important document for you to have to ensure that if ASIC comes knocking, you'll be well prepared, at least at a baseline. I thank you for the questions that are coming through. We're about to go into the second presentation for this morning, which is with Martin Lazarevic from National Crime Check, who will be talking about the evolving market within the digital verification of identification. And after that, we'll have our Q&A. Please keep your questions coming in. There are some there. I have several more that have come through differently and a couple of questions of my own. that we'll also deal with in the Q&A session after Martin has presented. So bear with us, and I'd like to now hand over to Martin and for his presentation, and then I will come back to you after that.
Thanks, Peter, for that handover across. For all of you who don't know me, my name's Martin from National Crime Check. We have recently launched a brand new identity solution called InstaID Plus into the marketplace. And today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the product, as well as sort of seeing how it applies to your getting bid ready or your best interest duty obligations. So just to set the business landscape, as you would be aware that identity and doing identity and proving identity, there's a lot of transactions, and most Australians go through this process, and we have hundreds of millions of everyday transactions you can see there that we do, such as applying for credit cards, mobile phone plans, police checks, as we well know, inquiring about accounts, and also interacting with government services. And with all the plethora of different ID transactions that are required out there, the current processes out there in the marketplace are quite frustrating at times and time consuming for the applicant. And really, it's not really addressing the issue of the growing incidence of synthetic IDs and manipulated IDs for businesses and those instances of fraud. So when we're requiring a need that's increasing to prove identity, each business and each government department and each transaction has different assurance requirements. And existing identity solutions out there in the marketplace are very much paper-based at times and require individuals to go offline and go get ID certified as a true copy. And what we're also seeing is really businesses grappling with their obligations, such as under what's coming up with BID, but also data privacy and security and sophisticated fraud, and losing customers as a result of off-ramping them into other identity types, or a manual process, or a process that really isn't quite consumer friendly. So what do we see here? So this is the real breadth of use cases out there that where InstaID Plus are currently looking to play in or have an existing footprint in. And what we're finding is, it expands across health and leisure to right through to travel and government and legal services. So you can see there are transactions that happen quite regularly to relatively infrequent. So the InstaID system looks to really address any type of different ID scenario that's required, ID verification scenario that's required, from very, very frequent right through to completely infrequent. So who is InstaID? So as mentioned to you, InstaID Plus is an offshoot of National Crime Check. It's been given its own legs, its own child per se, where we've been doing identity and being in the identity space for over 10 years, but particularly concentrating on the background screening or police check vertical. Our core technology that underpins InstaID Plus has processed over 2 million identity transactions. And we were one of the first to pioneer biometric facial recognition and liveness within the background screening and police check vertical. And in addition to that, we've really been on the forefront of pioneering additional integration layers and validation layers to really have what is called a multifaceted or cascading identity verification solution that really triangulates data sources and technology and clusters them together to form a really comprehensive and robust solution for organisations and people like yourselves to be able to meet identity verification requirements in a way that's secure, in a way that's really easily accessible, that providing you with the information that you need in a way to obtain that information that is really efficient and effective. So why InstaID Plus over whatever else is there in the marketplace? So what we've found is identity verification has really been constrained by manual processes, face-to-face requirements, paper-based administration, and really inconsistent application of the verification process. So, you know, where you have different use cases and you're dealing with buyers, sellers, lawyers, lenders, conveyancers, and brokers, you know, there isn't one consistent way of obtaining that information and verifying a applicant or verifying a candidate. So what InstaID Plus is, it really digitizes this process into rule sets that you can set and will meet requirements under a consistent flow by standardizing that whole process and really providing the access and distribution support for organizations who run very little transactions right through to, you know, mass volume transactions where we have the technology capability to suit, and really leveraging the existing platform and processes and end-to-end infrastructure that NCC has already created and already performed successfully millions of ID transactions for a federal government regulator, and really leveraging that expertise, that, you know, that skill set, that subject matter expertise in this space to give your organizations the confidence to use the product and be confident in using the product. So really, in summary of what InstaID Plus does, it solves the basic premise of these three questions. We can determine that the person in session is a real person and is live in session, that the person on the ID is the same person in session. So you can get confidence that that ID is linked to that person in session, and we can verify that ID against one or more independent and government data sources. So being able to have that multi-layer of investigation, having fraud tampering, and also government assistance with our verification of the documents really provides a multifaceted identity verification solution that is robust, effective, and reliable. So in addition to this, what makes us different? So not only do we provide the technology, but we also provide the service. So this is not simply just here, have a bit of technology, implement it into your process, and off you go and run with it. We actually provide the whole identity verification service. That includes reloop and redo. So when applicants have issues with providing expired IDs or the wrong type of ID, we actually have the journey flow support via email and phone to help these applicants through the process. We also have cleansing. So when applicants provide information on their ID that's different from the lodgement, that we actually cleanse the data, provide additional information, i.e. when names are in different names, we provide aliases, and we have that cleansing process and human quality assurance, so that what we're doing, as you can see by the graph there, we're increasing the number of conversions, i.e. by reducing the number of off-ramps due to binary identity verification services that are out there, which literally just go, does this information match yes or no with what's provided? We actually perform that cleanse and reloop to increase the likelihood of maintaining a continuance on that journey, whilst at the same time, the technology is able to reduce the instances of fraud through our various layers of identity verification solutions that we have as part of InstaID Plus. So what do you get at the end? So essentially what InstaID Plus provides is a report that is available either via API integration or via your own integration dashboard. That it's a secure storage facility that's easily searchable, easily retrievable, and a PDF report that contains information that provides the documents themselves, what's been verified, metadata information, the selfie, and all the other services that you've purchased as part of this product. It actually shows and demonstrates into a report that you can then store and maintain that information and be compliant with the different types of use cases that you may have as a mortgage broker, and be aligned with the requirements and regulations that are set forth within being bid ready as well. So we provide you that identity solution to be able to use it under multiple different circumstances, and it is all helping you with your identity requirements to be bid ready. So what we have now is a video for you that really summarizes in about 2 minutes the process, with some really good infographics, etc., on what it is and what it does and what you get out of it. And then after that, we'll come back for for a case study to show how it's actually working in real life.
The rise of data breaches and identity theft means your organisation needs to verify customers with a high level of trust and meet their demand for service. But who can you trust? InstaID Plus is a leading-edge identity verification solution powered by National Crime Check and has performed over 2 million biometric identity verifications to aid police checks. InstaID Plus offers layered security that is cost-effective, end-to-end, configurable, flexible, fast, and with customer support direct to your applicant. InstaID Plus deters fraudsters, protecting your organisation to increase conversions and reduce fraud. Using multi-factor authentication, combining artificial intelligence, machine learning, and facial recognition, we can match a digital identity with the real identity. Our quick and easy process also allows your customers choice of device so they can verify their identity anywhere, anytime. Here's how it works. The customer takes a photo of themselves holding their government-issued photo ID. The customer takes a photo of the ID document. The document is checked for authenticity and tampering to prove it is genuine. Using facial recognition and liveness detection, the selfie is compared to the photo on the ID to confirm it is the same person. Personal details are extracted automatically from the ID and checked against credible sources. If anything is missing, our customer support team will contact your applicant directly and help them through the process. All of these factors will provide an overall verification result fast. Our state-of-the-art customer journey provides a simple verification process to make sure the person pictured on a photo ID is the same person in possession of the ID. And with our flexible deployment options, we can have you up and running in no time with zero IT development required from you. When you need fast, convenient, secure identity solutions, you can trust InstaID Plus. Find out how InstaID Plus can help you verify your customers by visiting us at instaid.plus.
That's the promo video that really is quite intricate and nice explainer of what we do. So how is it applying in real life? So here's a case study of one of our earliest adopters of the InstaID product, Pinksterboa Property. Pinksterboa is a property specialist in Adelaide, and they offer conveyancing services as well as property settlements divisions and surveying. And what the use case behind using InstaID Plus was when COVID kicked in, there was an issue where individuals were unable to attend face-to-face appointments. And this became very problematic for their organisation because, you know, not only were there was office shutdowns, etc. So meeting off-site became problematic. Candidates' reluctance to also at that time leave their homes and meet someone that they didn't know. There was this real apprehension around doing things, and also the logistical coordination of meeting someone, making sure that they're there, making sure they have the right ID, became quite problematic and cumbersome for that organisation. So Pinksterboa started using InstaID Plus, and essentially what they did was they would, when a property settlement or a conveyancing requirement was present, they would invite an applicant via their online dashboard to complete their identity requirement in their own home using a device of their choice, as the promo video mentioned. We're browser and device agnostic, so they were able to use their computer or their webcam or their mobile phone or tablet, and at any time complete that process. And what the system also does is it has continuous reminders as well to be able to help property managers like Pinksterboa and conveyancers like Pinksterboa to be able not have to continuously follow up because the system does it for them. And the storage of that information in a secure two-factor authenticated integration dashboard allowed them to be compliant with all their other regulations, and they love it. they find the process has really reinvented the way that they do things. They're able to do it a lot quicker, and the time taken on their end to coordinate things was cut down quite significantly. So hopefully by reading this this case study as well and watching the video, you can see how it may apply to your organisation, not only for you know, property settlements and mortgage broking in terms of the application of loans and things like that, but there might be other identity requirements that you think, oh wow, really I could use this system, and the actual dashboard allows you to create your own rule sets to be able to do your own proof of identity. So thanks for taking the time to listen to our identity verification solution that will hopefully help you get bid ready. I'm going to hand it back to Pete now. We're going to go through, I think, a Q&A session, and happy to answer any questions you may have about InstaID Plus. Thanks very much.
Oh, sorry, thanks very much, Martin. Hopefully we didn't cut you off short there. Martin, thanks for that. And there's nothing like best of breed when it comes to tech. And we have questions that have come through in regards to the InstaID platform, and we'll answer those shortly. And I'd like to invite both David and Martin into the Q&A session, and we have quite a few questions that have come through. Unfortunately, I'm battling between multiple levels of tech for this because I'm getting questions in different directions, as well as questions I've got that I want answered too. So David and Martin, if you could come back live for us, and we'll start the Q&A. And whilst we're waiting for that, remember that you will receive a link to do the knowledge testing component of the course. That is as equally as important as any of this. This is a course. You do get a certificate for completing it. You need to answer the questions in the knowledge testing to get that, as well as to get your hands on the toolkit, which you're going to want. That link will come to you tomorrow, though. You won't get it straight away. This is being recorded, so it'll be available for you to view whilst you're doing the knowledge testing, so you can review what we've spoken about here today. So just remember that link will come to you tomorrow, and once you complete that, you will knowledge testing, you'll then get the opportunity to, or you'll be given your certificate and get the compliance pack as well. Gentlemen, thank you for joining back with us. Appreciate the presentations. A whole level of information and knowledge that is imperative as we go forward into 2021 and is relevant today, obviously, of course, but yeah, the regulatory obligations, and also, I guess in a lot of respects, the future of our industry is in our hands at the moment, because we are looking on multiple fronts of, if you like, best of breed outcomes, and we need to make sure we get this right, because in 2022, we have a further review of brokers' remuneration. It'll be undertaken by the ACCC and the Council of Financial Regulators. We need to make sure we've got every box ticked, and we are doing what we can to ensure that we're optimising the outcomes of what we do. So it's an interesting time, and I'm sure once we're done with this, there'll be something else that comes along. So out of all the years I've been doing this, there's always something next. So what I'm going to do is, before we jump into the question box, which I've got here, and I'll go through those basically in order so here. But David, I wanted just to ask you a question. When we're talking about the obligations and talking about credit assistance and the manner in which regulation is turned around, talking about credit intermediaries, what is practically a credit intermediary? Is it an aggregator? As an example.
Well, and so an intermediary is somebody who is some way involved in getting a customer from off the street to in front of a product provider, but they're not actually recommending or suggesting the particular product or helping the customer to apply. So I guess examples would be a lead generator, for example. So if you run a website that generates leads and you then put leads out to broking services, for the purpose of then having those brokers provide credit assistance to customers, then the person generating the leads, finding the customers and feeding them in is an intermediary.
Okay. Good. And we can ask David hard questions because he's ex-ASIC and he's used to hard questions.
So yeah, an aggregator, I guess, could be an intermediary in that sense if they're not providing the credit service themselves if they're not providing credit assistance, but they're facilitating the movement of customers' applications into a credit provider. And one really interesting example when the legislation was being developed was that Australia Post would have been defined as an intermediary by delivering information about credit to customers, and it had to specifically be excluded in the regulations. Otherwise, it would have been an intermediary.
Yeah, I tell you, yeah, it's interesting with these things and the journey it goes on. It starts off with something quite sensible, then tends to want to become unnecessarily complicated. Then you've got to unbundle the complication to come back to something you say, okay, well, I can work through this, and then some other pillar comes along that makes it harder again beyond where you actually had landed. It's a never-ending moving beast, but anyhow, we will keep working through it. Martin, from your point of view, with the verification of identification and knowing the digital platforms, but putting, I guess, the brand to one side, is that how do you see that getting this right actually has a benefit under a best interest duty? Because to me, I guess, yeah, we can see internationally on a global platform the amount of fraud that goes on. So getting verification right would have to be critically important in this journey.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been around the block for quite some time with identity verification under different use cases. And one thing that we've seen more and more prevalent is the rise of synthetic IDs. Now, synthetic IDs is a really fancy term for a manipulated document that is very, very good and will generally pass the eye test, right? So I could put up a bunch of synthetic IDs and you look at them and go, well, they look ritchy-ditch. And really, without having additional layers of technology to help you do this process and use a stock standard thing like, oh, yep, show it to me in person or show it to me over a Skype call or a video call, and you hold it up and yep, you can see it looks like that, but you know, we've got technology behind the scenes that has identified certain features and functions of those documents and whether they've been used in fraudulent activities before to be able to help that process. That plus coupled with the fact that you know the individual themselves, by having this technology, makes it harder and harder for those ones to actually pass the tests.
I think that's an important piece you just touched on there, is that it's not just really about the identity as we see it today, but it's also looks back a bit to see if there's been past fraud or manipulations that have happened sometime in history that you don't necessarily see today, which creates a journey of conduct, if you like.
Correct. So it's really leveraging, you know, the present the past intelligence that we've got in our systems to be able to help brokers be comfortable and confident that the ID that's being presented is true and valid.
Okay. I better jump into some of these questions that are sitting here online, otherwise I can see time is going to beat us. And some of the things that David spoke about, actually a lot of the things David spoke about in his presentation, let me just frame and say the FBAA is working on to sort out. We're going to touch on a couple of those things at the moment, but don't think that anything where David has said that, you know, it's gone from this to this and it's been overreached in an RG, that we aren't battling those things, because we are. But we'll touch on some of them in a sec, so I can see them in the questions here. First one we'll talk about is, the question we have is, does it mean that we have clawback arrangements still in place? I think the answer to that is quite simply, yes, we do. The way the legislation has moved from coming out of the Financial Services Royal Commission and into RG 273 from ASIC is basically clawbacks can't go beyond 2 years, and brokers cannot pass a clawback back to a borrower. I am personally against clawbacks 100%, unless you breach the law, unless you breach your contract, that's different. But otherwise, I've been opposed forever, and we are still battling that conversation. But David, is that basically right, bar the little piece of rhetoric at the end from me as a political statement?
100%, that's right.
Yeah, okay, well, there you go. There's the answer on clawbacks. Next one is regards, do we need to compare credit card facilities, as aggregators do not have the software in place to do this? The simple reality is that David did touch on this in regards to the bundled products position, and I was going to bring it up here. We had an agreement with government at the end of last year that the best interest duty would be applied to the predominant debt within the bundled product, which 99.99% of the time is going to be the home loans. It twisted a couple of times when it came out through ASIC, and I think we're up to, including emails and submissions, close to 4 submissions on this to ASIC, and also recent this week, sorry, whatever, last week to Treasury. I've lost track of time already. To Treasury around where this has landed on the credit card facilities, specifically because lenders don't provide any optics to aggregators on credit card facilities. I would imagine aggregators would be able to accommodate it within their current software systems because it'd be just another product. I might be wrong on that, but that was what I posed to ASIC, and what I've also posed to Treasury is that the lenders don't give the information, the aggregators aren't prepared to receive it, so the brokers can't get it. How can you expect to apply a best interest duty on bundled products where predominantly it's a credit card that's in the bundle, where you have no optics? It is impossible. It was agreed to by government that that would not be the case, that it would be on the predominant debt, unless you've got a 100 grand credit card and a $10,000 home loan, but we'll park that to one side as the exception and most certainly not the rule, that it shouldn't apply. And we're fighting with enormous vigour, both with politicians, Treasury and ASIC, to have this fixed. Now, I don't know, and David, you are the expert in this field. I'm sorry, David's down there on my screen. If I'm looking down, that's why, and Martin's over there. Is that what's the likelihood of ASIC changing their mind? I think it's probably unlikely, and it's more the fact that lenders are going to have to stump up, provide the details and the optics across credit cards, both standalone and within a bundle, so it needs to be standalone as well. And aggregators are going to have to be able to deliver it down to brokers, and that's going to take time and certainly is not going to happen by 1 January. So Dave, what's your thoughts? Is ASIC going to change their mind, do you think?
Look, I think it's unlikely. The first thing ASIC does is say as well, is there a consumer detriment in us leaving it there? No, possibly not. There might be one consumer in 20 million might be saved by the obligation to compare the small bundled product. So let's leave it there. If it's a problem for industry, that's bad luck. Plus, removing it from their guidance would be a concession that they probably didn't get it right first time, which is also difficult to have happen. What could happen is that it could stay in the guidance, but they just have no appetite to enforce it. And so they may never really the enforcement.
That'd be a risk.
But I've always said I don't like things in the guidance where technically ASIC could come out and sit at your desk and say, look, that's a great home loan product you put the client into, but how about this credit card? It ain't that flash. And you're suddenly at risk of your $1 million fine for breaching best interest duty because there were a very small credit contract pinned onto the bottom of something much more significant.
And something in today's market you can't see because there's no details, no optics given by the lender through the aggregator to the broker. So technically, and here's my argument back to Treasury last week and my arguments with ASIC, come 1 January, any broker that offers an ADI's home loan that has a credit card attached to it is basically going to be in breach of bid because they've given no guidance on the credit card. The only thing they can say is, can't offer you that product because we can't give you guidance on it because we can't meet a best interest duty.
That's whilst that guidance remains in place, and if ASIC had the appetite to prosecute it in that fashion, then I think that risk always remains unless it's removed.
Yeah, it's garbage. I can assure everyone, I will fight tooth and nail to ensure that we see this thing corrected and plays out the right way. And unfortunately, it may mean that it's still in place, but we have the optics to meet the obligation. But if that's the case, I think we need an extension of 6 to 12 months at least to be able to get banks to modify their systems, which have enough trouble with their legacy systems as it is, to actually provide the details, the aggregators to be able to then disseminate those details down through to the brokers and provide an opportunity to actually get used to doing something we've never had to do.
And the banks are subject to bid, so their motivations wouldn't be that high to start with, would they?
Yeah. Now, all they had to do was comply to the guidance from government, which was said applied to the predominant debt. 99% of the problem solved. And this has just gotten out of control. Anyhow, Dave, you and I have had that argument a bit. Sorry?
The regulatory guide misquotes the very paragraph that the obligation is embedded in. They only talk about the top half of the paragraph, and when you read the whole paragraph, the sentence that gets left out of the regulatory guide is the sentence from government that says it applies to the bundle.
Yeah, exactly. And just for the record, we have pointed that out, I think, on multiple occasions. Probably not to their enjoyment, but anyhow, we better move on. We have a question here that if my business is asset finance only, I am able to write mortgages but don't, and I simply refer clients to a mortgage broker to complete their mortgages, would BID apply to my business? So it's acting under a referral basis. And I'm assuming that referral is compliant to the NCCP. We'll just take that.
Here's the kicker. So yes, if you're asset finance and you don't write mortgage, you don't provide credit assistance in relation to mortgages, you're not a mortgage broker by definition. You would have to watch out though whether you passing clients to somebody else for them to provide credit assistance could be looked at as providing credit assistance. But provided you're referring clients off to someone else who then considers products and suitability, you are on fairly safe ground that you're not a mortgage broker by definition.
Yeah, okay. I have some questions here around ID style of thoughts, which may overlap into some thoughts from David as well. But how does this work when I am just one step in the chain? If the lender requires me to identify consumers face to face, is this going to beat the requirements? So I guess this is a part of the evolution of banks. I think that's being looked at the moment. I know I've had discussions with the ABA and various banks as to where they are going with digital documents, digital signatories, and digital verifications. And I think it almost falls back to, at the moment, it's up to the individual lenders to give guidance as to what you can and can't do until such time as laws change. What's thoughts on that, Martin?
Yeah, that's what we're finding is around what each of the lenders are deeming acceptable as to what they require. And there is, as you mentioned, Peter, there isn't a lot of overarching consistency between the lenders at the moment, and it's a shifting, not shifting sands, but it's an evolving space. And really, yeah, at this point in time, really you're going to seek guidance from your individual lenders. Each of those lenders will have an ID verification requirement and what they will generally accept, and some of them have quite a number of different ways to accept. Others are very specific on what they need to do in that space. So,
David, you got a view?
Well, yeah, actually the identity issue is a lender responsibility under AML. There's nothing under credit legislation that actually requires brokers or credit assistance providers to do anything. So it's actually the lenders meeting their legal obligations, passing those obligations down onto brokers, which is why quite often they become the broker obligations to start with.
There will be a much heightened focus on this. I've had various meetings with senior ministers within government, and I know that government has a very heightened focus on digital outcomes, whether it be a whole of government approach or very specific things they're looking at. I think it's one of the unintended consequences of COVID, and as disastrous as that has been, but pushing forward digital validations, digital solutions has taken an enormous step forward compared to if it was just another same old year. So I know there's a body that was formed, gosh, it must be 20 years ago now, to look at various digitisations and consistency and platforms within our industry. And one of its early opportunities was to create an application form that was acceptable to everyone. And it still basically doesn't exist today. And it's the simplest bloody thing on the planet. Yeah. Let's continue on. Instant ID looks great, but will lenders accept this?
Goes back to that same question we just answered in relation to this. So lenders, we are discussing with lenders at the moment around accepting Insta ID Plus. They're grappling with a whole bunch of different things. From a bid perspective, though, you might look to consider Insta ID Plus as more of an internal compliance for your own benefit around being able to verify the identity of applicants for your own use, so that you can say that you're doing the process. But it's very multifaceted at the moment with lenders, and as we mentioned, they don't even have an application form that's the same, let alone their identity verification process.
I think one of the challenges that the banks are looking at is a once-only solution. So I do it now, and that solution carries forward. Whereas, see, for mortgage brokers, our legal obligation under the NCCP is verification of identification for an application. Whereas we've also got VOI in the matter of a conveyance, which is different and doesn't apply to us. But I think there may be a thought there in the banking system. Well, if you had something that carried it all, you sort of do it there, and you maybe just do an update there rather than doing two different things as such, would be a solution. Yeah, Martin, I suggest maybe you want to have a chat to the lead association there with the bankers, because that might be something I think that they could well and truly do with having a chat to you on.
Absolutely.
Another question here, David, this one's going to be yours. Why don't banks comply to a best interest duty?
Because they can't.
Well, there you go. That's it.
Imagine walking in the front door of a branch and going, "Hey, can you help me with a loan?" And they'd have to look at a competitor's product and work out if they're going to make the client better off or not.
Yeah.
I mean, we functionally that really is the issue, right? It's just we've kind of asked that question in the past, and the answer is it just wouldn't be practical for banks to have to comply with the best interest duty. Part of that goes to the notion that if a customer walks into a bank directly, they've made the choice to deal with that institution, and therefore it shouldn't be incumbent on that institution to talk them out of it or to send them down the road to something better. Whereas there's a degree of opacity with mortgage brokers where you're not always clear of what products and lenders you may be dealing with. So that really underpins it. But yeah, I think it would just be too difficult to regulate to subject banks to a best interest duty.
And the pushback I get is that they're obligated under the Banking Code of Practice as well, so that they tend to use that as a bit of an out for many things. And folks, I know we're running over time, but I do want to answer all these questions. If you can't stay with us the entire time, when you go to do your knowledge testing, this will be there in full. So if you do have to leave us early, because we're running a bit over time, this will all be a part of the recording that you'll see when you do the knowledge testing, which will come to you in the link tomorrow. All right, let's keep moving through these questions. I do want to get through them all. I may leave some of mine out. So do you have to use that ID system, or if you meet face-to-face, that is still okay? Well, meeting face-to-face is still okay. I don't think that's changed at all. It's really the evolution of the market as it progresses from being traditionally stuck in the mud face-to-face to looking at the solutions to do it digitally, which has been driven largely in a much faster manner because of COVID and the fact that people couldn't move around. But also the simple reality is that this is life of the future. You know, we're actually seeing the future in advance that we need to interplay with now. And I imagine, Martin, that in the future, all ID is going to be done digitally. Face-to-face stuff will become the exception, no longer the rule as such.
Yeah, and what the question will be asked more so is, what document validation have you performed on that ID, right? And just saying, well, I eyeballed it, I don't know in the future if that's going to cut it. You need to have independent verification of that data source or something along the lines of that happening. So you're going to have to do that anyway. That has to be done digitally. You can't do that. You can't rock up to, you know, the Department of Home Affairs DBS service and go, hey, please, can you put this number through? So, you know, it's maintaining that consistency of approach regarding, you know, digital verifications.
Okay. I have another question here, I guess, is with government changing or removing cost of living parameters, how will that affect bid compliance? Now, I don't think they're actually changing, removing the cost of living parameters. I think there'll be a different optic across what PEM looks like, or the deep drill on, I went and bought a Chico roll down the street, and you know, is that impacting my cost of living within my expenses? Dave, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. What's going to happen is that the level of granularity that we got to because of the changes to the ASIC regulatory guidance are probably going to fall off. So we're no longer going to test whether you've met your obligations by looking at a bank statement to see if you picked up every Chico roll. It'll probably go back more towards what we had pre-NCCP, which is looking at a customer's history, their propensity to pay, and then doing a broader test of saying, look, you earn X dollars a month. Historically, the person in your situation or typically spends about Y dollars a month. X minus Y is your surplus. And I think we'll be able to go back to a more logical assessment approach where you can talk to a customer about changing their spending habits after they get the loan, and that it will be reasonable to rely on a customer saying, yes, I'll go out for dinner less often once I get the mortgage. Whereas we really got to a point with responsible lending that whatever someone did before they got the mortgage was almost proof of what they were going to do afterwards, which made it quite difficult to work with. So I'm hoping we'll go back to just more broad standards of common sense and looking at a customer's willingness to pay as well as their financial position.
Very similar comments in the conversation I had with Treasury last week around this and the way RG 209, responsible lending obligations, moving around. And people just remember, responsible lending isn't disappearing. It's evolving into another piece, partly underpinned by APRA, and it still applies to things like small cap loans and consumer leases. It's going through its evolution as well, so there's not necessarily double ups of legislation in the marketplace, and will be predominantly under the auspices of APRA. And also too that this isn't a done deal. I mean, this is something that's proposed by the Treasurer. It's got to go through a parliamentary process, and it's got to be approved through that, which I assume it will be, but there's going to be some strong opposition to it. And their hope is to get that before government by the end of the year and for it to be enacted into law in March of 2021. So that's sort of the timeline at the moment for that. Last couple of questions here and we're going to wrap up. Is a credit representative on a bank-owned aggregator licensee has a conflict of interest under a best interest duty or for brokering for broker offering that particular lender's product? So if a bank owns an aggregator, is there a conflict if a broker uses that product?
Look, the answer is there could be. The test of whether there's a conflict is when there's a where there is a pressure to do something other than an obligation that you owe to the customer. So as we were talking about in the training, you may have mutually beneficial goals, and so it won't always be a conflict to be a bank-owned entity and recommend that bank's products. But I think you would logically identify it as a potential conflict. And then what you would do is ensure that that isn't disadvantaging the customer, so that when you're actually recommending that product, it's the right one for the customer. So that's the second half of the conflict thing, is to not disadvantage the customer.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Martin, would the BOID, the ID check at Australia Post not detect manipulated IDs? Would they pick up that sort of thing?
It's essentially achieving this middle ground. So if you can't go and see an applicant face-to-face, the idea is to send them to Australia Post where they perform the face-to-face, right? Because obviously they have a network of branches around the country. They are still doing an eyeball of the ID, exactly the same as what you would do. So it's just leveraging their network to be able to do it, and apparently they are trained. Now, the word on the street, and I'm not speaking out of school here, is the guy in the post office franchise he's just looking at the document and will not run it through any other third-party verification technology, etc. It's literally just he's going to be looking at the individual and looking at the document, make sure the data matches up, and signs the thing and go, yeah, no worries, I've seen it. Similarly, it's a similar sort of strategy to a certified true copy. So if you go to a pharmacist and he does the same thing, it's exactly that sort of level of rigor that's going on. It's just being able to use their network of branches to be able to perform that service.
Okay, excellent. We might just start to come to close. I guess that one of the key messages from my point of view is that record keeping is going to be king. Doesn't matter how you go about any of this, you've got to have brilliant records. You need to tick all the boxes. The compliance toolkit that you'll get when we finish the training piece here, once you've done the knowledge testing, we'll assist in part with that as well, together with what your aggregator produces. But documentation's king. Don't be under any misunderstanding of that. Without documentation in place, you're going to fall into holes you wish you'd never gone into. And of course, a lot of this has come about because, and we're in this position because at the end of the day, the definitions that came out within the bill and then the explanatory memorandum where they talk about finance brokers versus mortgage brokers, if that didn't happen and if they listened to the guidance given by the FBAA and by industry that this should be applied to the actual activity and not the business or the person, a lot of this wouldn't happen. Because those who are asset brokers, who are technically finance brokers these days, by way of definition, are carved out of this until you step over the line. But David, if I'm correct, that line isn't 100% clear. So if I was to do one home loan a year as a finance broker, who's an asset broker, I'm probably not caught. If I do 4, I'm likely caught. What happens if I do 3? Grey line.
Yeah, it's a bit like the old state-based. If you're who's a used car dealer? If you sell your car second-hand, you're not a used car dealer. But if you happen to sell 3 cars a year second-hand, are you a used car dealer, or is it 4, or is it 5? So you know there's a grey line. I think fortunately most people are either nowhere near it or don't do it at all. But it would have just been so much better to have said when you're writing a mortgage, best interest duty. You could, the next file on your desk, if it happens to be a asset finance, then no best interest duty. I think we could have worked with that quite happily.
You would think a no-brainer, and became unnecessarily complicated to why most of these conversations we're having now actually are happening, because that definition was just taken way off the scope as to where it should have landed.
And it wasn't even Payne's recommendation. So if you read recommendation 1.2 from the Royal Commission, it was very clear and very succinct. And then somehow
that's one thing we can't. Yeah, sorry.
No, it just got interpreted into something utterly different.
Something else. Yeah, it's one thing we can't blame the Hayne Commission for. They probably got it right. Everybody subsequently got it wrong, except for industry. Yeah. Apologies. What can you do? Is there a simple way of maintaining or managing a conflict of interest? Bar the fact that don't go there. What I'm getting at is disclosure adequate or not? Because quite often people think that's adequate for mitigating a conflict of interest. In this instance, no.
So under the Corporations Act, the financial services regime, disclosure was your primary weapon. So provided you disclosed a conflict, you could proceed to provide advice to a customer that was heavily conflicted. That when the NCCP was brought in, it was expressly reversed. And so if you look at the general obligations of licensees under section 47, I think, of the Act, the second one is that you can't disadvantage a customer from a conflict. So you don't actually have to disclose conflicts, whereas under financial services, you have to disclose them, but you can hurt customers with them. Under the credit law, you don't have to disclose them, you have to make sure they don't hurt customers. I mean, a lot of people will disclose conflicts because it's kind of ingrained in the whole advice process, I guess. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't harm the customer, then it's good to go.
Okay, all right, there you go. We are way over time, and I do apologise. But gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a very engaging conversation. I think, again, one of the most important conversations our industry is going to have in the current times in which we are. So thank you so much for your contributions today, and we'll look forward to hearing again from you in the not too distant future as things progress on. So I'll let you guys go. Thank you for that. And a couple of little housekeeping messages for everybody else is that don't forget you need to complete the entire education course to get your 3 CPD hours. Probably going to be a bit more than that now. It's probably going to be close to 3.5 after I've gone on for probably too long. But you'll get your seal, get the information. Tomorrow you'll get the link to do the knowledge test, right? Don't forget, you've got to get that link. You must do that knowledge test to complete this course. Once you have done that, completed the course successfully, you'll get your certificate for completion, you'll get your compliance pack, and you'll be good to go. So, and of course, if you need to watch these things again, they'll be available on the FBAA YouTube or via our website. You'll be able to find them there. But when you do the knowledge testing through AAMC with that link that you'll get tomorrow, this video, this training course, this component of it will be put on video and available for you to review to help answer questions. Anyhow, good luck. Bid will be on us before we know it. We will come back to you with updates on various matters that we've spoken about today that is still being challenged. And for now, again, I thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks very much, and bye for now.